All right, now we've got the psychology of human development. I'm going to warn you, this slideshow has like 1,000 slides in it. So I'm going to be cruising through it. The first thing I want to say is that lifespan developmental psychologists look at the whole lifespan from birth to death, or really to what happens before you're born to what happens after you're dead, and everything in between. And traditionally, lifespan psychologists or developmental psychologists break the lifespan into phases or stages that you pass through from beginning to end. And so we might think of like infancy, toddlerhood, childhood, adolescence, adulthood, and so on, breaking it into age categories, the size of the body, what's happening in the mind and the brain, what's happening sexually, what's happening from a cognitive thinking and knowledge standpoint and problem-solving capability, moral development. We could look at spiritual development. Pretty much every aspect of the human person can be broken up into these stages where you can start at the low end and kind of end up at the high end. In recent years, and it's not really reflected in this presentation, a lot of developmental psychologists have been challenging this stage model, looking at more holistic ways of understanding development, maybe recognizing that we don't pass through stages. We're always kind of in all of the stages. That there are parts of an advanced stage that we experience very early in life, and then even though we might be old and wise, we may still kind of struggle with earlier stage problems. So keep all of that in mind. Most of what you'll see here has to do with these clear and explicit stages. So those stages, or rather development, is generally divided into three categories: the bodily changes or physical development, the mind changes or cognitive development, and then the relationships and emotional world or psychosocial development. So in a developmental textbook, what you'll generally see is stages across the lifespan, and then each stage divided into these three categories. So we can look at each of those changes throughout the lifespan. So what does it mean to be normal? It's a product of using the standard bell curve, which we saw in previous chapters, and applying it to humans. So how big should a 3-year-old be? Well, how big are most 3-year-olds? And so you take all of the 3-year-olds and then measure their mass and their height and their weight, and then you create a bell curve, and then right in the middle is what a 3-year-old should be. But of course, there's lots of variability, and you can be on the high or low end of that bell curve, so you can be above or below average and still be perfectly fine. You're just not, you don't fit the norm. So how quickly should you learn language? How quickly should you start reading? How quickly should you be sexually active? All of those things are norms defined by what's most common and not necessarily what represents you or what's best for you. Okay, the stage version of looking at development is right here. So like you have these discrete categories, you jump from one to the next, and it's very clear that you're in these different stages. This is called discontinuous development. So for example, you were in middle school, and then you graduated from middle school, and now you're in high school. And so you were changing all the time in middle school, but you were always a middle schooler. And then one day, you're not a middle schooler anymore, and now you're a high schooler. And you're a high schooler for 4 years, and then maybe you take a job or you go to college, and now you're a college student. So these are discontinuous. These are breaks in development where you jump from one stage to another. I was single, and then I was dating, then I was engaged, and now I'm married. So that's discontinuous ways of looking at development, and that can be useful sometimes, especially when there are these clear cuts in between events in our lives and who we are. Then over here we have continuous development. I think this is the most helpful way of looking at us holistically, and it recognizes that even though on one day you're a middle schooler and the next day you were a high schooler, You were changing every day in middle school a little bit. Who you were was changing, your likes, your interests, your skills, your relationships. All of this was under constant change. And so the continuous model recognizes that every day things are happening. There's not like a hard and fast change. In fact, even when you go from middle school to high school, yes, your designation has changed, but you still kind of feel like the same person. And there might have been days in middle school where you changed more, even though you stayed in middle school, than you changed going from middle school to high school. You might think that when you graduate from college and get a full-time job, you'll be a new person. And part of that will be true. You'll be going from college to like your full-time job, but you're also kind of just gradually changing. Is there one course of development or many? I haven't thought about this. It's a general question. I wouldn't think that there's one course of development, but I'm happy that it's being proposed here. So there's studies that show that children from all around the world reach language milestones in a similar sequence. That's between 6 and 8 months, recognizing the morphemes of a language. So perhaps it doesn't matter where you grow up. You'll always learn language at the same time. But there's also evidence for many courses. So there's cultural differences in childcare practices. So in the U.S., for example, we kind of rush our kids along. We want them to develop skills as quickly as possible so that they'll be better. It's very competitive, and that's not the case in other cultures. So I'm happy there's not a clear answer for that, because I think it's way more nuanced than is there one course of development. I've mentioned this before in I think the context of intelligence, but is development something that happens just naturally? Someone is born and then they'll progress through these stages in a genetic predisposition, or does the environment kind of bring these changes out of them? So you're born that way, there's no changing it, that's the nature argument, or does your environment and the people around you, do they shape you and help you develop? That's the nurture argument. And so there's evidence on both sides. Most psychologists will say that there are contributions from both. So some of your development is genetically predetermined, other parts are brought about by your environment. That's been a theme across all these chapters. So here are 4 different theories of life development. I'm going to skip over the psychosexual theory because I don't know it very well, but that comes from Freud. The psychosocial theory I'll spend more time on. That comes from Erikson. The cognitive theory began with Piaget and it's been supplanted by some others. And then moral development is Kohlberg, I believe. All right, so Sigmund Freud divided development into these psychosexual stages. And to be honest, I never really understood these, so I'll let you read about them. Erikson was a psychoanalyst, and he reinterpreted Freud's stages, and rather than focusing on sexual development or sexual, it really isn't even sexual development. I'm not sure what it means to say psychosexual development, so I won't try to. Erikson interpreted these stages socially, recognizing that we're born into a relationship with a mother, and there are certain social needs we have, and those needs change throughout our lifespan. And he kind of recognized that it's a cyclical process, and we don't pass through each stage once and for all, but we're always kind of in between multiple stages. So here are those stages. When we're born, our main problem in life is, will we survive, and will our environment take care of us? Can we trust our environment, or must we be on the defensive all the time? As we get older, we start to see what we can do, see what we can accomplish. So like toddlers are trying to figure out how big they can be and how strong they can be. But then we're also worried about making mistakes and being criticized. And then what can we take on for ourselves? We don't need to be told what to do all the time. We can find our own path, and we hope that people will recognize the work that we've done and appreciate that. So it's the initiative versus maybe I'm not doing enough, maybe I should work harder, guilt. So guilt is actually like this more sophisticated form of shame and doubt. Then we move on to actually seeing the benefits of the work that we do, seeing our work pay off. That's the industry versus inferiority. If we fail repeatedly, we think ourselves as a failure. That's like that's a problem of stage 4. One of the big problems of our existence when we're in that stage. In adolescence, primarily, we're focused on who we are and who we ought to be. Whether or not who we are is something that we perform at, or does it come naturally. That's something that I'm almost 40 and I still kind of wonder about identity. It's something I've studied because it still kind of seems like a mess for me. There's not a clear identity that I feel like I am. So maybe I'm between 4 and 5 still right now. Intimacy versus isolation has to do with building long-lasting relationships. They can be romantic, and typically in this stage model they are, but it can also be like a long-term friend. Can we build relationships and be truly accepted by someone who knows us, or will we be alone? And maybe we're always alone, and so there's that tension. Generativity deals with the next generation. Will we have kids and like support the next generation that way? Will we volunteer our time? What are we doing to ensure support of what comes after us? So this is getting towards the tail end of our lifespan, looking at what comes next. And then integrity versus despair. Can we look back at our lives and say that everything was as it needed to be? Or will we resent problems and mistakes and people in our lives and become despairing? So all of that psychosocial development, you could spend a whole decade studying that, exploring it, researching it. And perhaps some of you will. All right, then we have cognitive development, and Jean Piaget was one of the first psychologists to document his observations with children. So he had a child psychology laboratory, and he spent hours and hours just observing children at work, like in the classroom, solving problems, reading, talking about time. And he wrote a whole bunch of books like about how childs perceive time and how children perceive time, how they solve problems, just these really detailed catalogs. And he proposed 4 stages of cognitive development. So at the very youngest ages, infants develop just physical skills, the ability to hold objects and move them and manipulate them, and there's a certain intelligence there, and that has to be developed. And then there's various levels of being able to think about concepts and solve problems, and so you can look through these 4 different stages. The very highest stage has to do with being able to apply rules and principles to solve problems of things that can't be seen. So we call that logic or abstract thinking. There were 2 terms down here at the bottom of this earlier slide, assimilation and accommodation, and this was how Piaget proposed people learn. So at first, let's say like you know a little bit about your identity and like the way your parents do things and your family does things, and you go to school and people are doing things differently. Wait a minute, this friend is from a different kind of family and they don't do things the way we do. They eat different food than we do. And so at first there's assimilation. You take, okay, that food's different, but it's kind of like me because I'm eating a sandwich and they're eating like a soup, or let's say we don't eat soup for lunch, but it's kind of like mine because they're both food, and so you try to understand something by comparing it or fitting it into your own system. That's assimilation. And then at a higher stage, you can transform your existing system to make it more, maybe you widen it. Okay, not everyone eats a sandwich for lunch. People can eat all sorts of things for lunch. Lunch isn't just sandwiches. It's all of this stuff. So maybe I can eat other stuff too. And so what we've done is change the system. That's called accommodation. And you can look at a lot of the skills you learn in college this way. At first, you're trying to make sense of new information and fitting it into pre-existing knowledge networks that you have, your own belief system, value system. And then eventually, the more you do that, your value systems start to change and widen to accommodate other value systems. Lawrence Kohlberg, good, his name is there so I can correct myself if I'm wrong, he identified 3 stages of moral development. So moral development being the ability to recognize when something is right or wrong. So when we first start thinking of right and wrong, it's very black and white. If you break the law, you're bad. If you follow the law, you're good. Black and white. If you're in jail, you're bad. If you're not in jail, you're good. But of course, it's not always so black and white. It's possible to find someone in jail who did nothing wrong, and the people who put him there are corrupt. Put them there are corrupt. And so being able to recognize that morality isn't black and white shows a pretty higher level of morality, moral development. So at the very high end, we get these like universal laws. So maybe if you follow a religion, you believe they're like this in the sanctity of life, and that it doesn't matter what the laws are, what the rules are. There are certain virtues and values that transcend man or transcend humans. And so it goes all the way from black and white to this like universal law. And so you'll fall somewhere in between there. And it could vary based on the situation that you're in, what level of morality you're at. So here we've got the breakdown of the whole lifespan from prenatal through adulthood. And I guess this is going to be physiological development. So I'm going to let you look at those things. These are the changes that happen in the body, starting with the germinal stage or germination. That's when you were conceived, all the way through the growth of the embryo, the growth of the fetus, what can influence fetal development for good or for bad, what happens. So here's a warning not to drink while you're pregnant. The sort of developmental reflexes that newborns have and problems with those possibly. Here's the physical development through childhood, what's happening in the nervous system and what's happening with the control of the body and the motor skills, what's happening with the ability to solve problems and think, so the cognitive development through childhood and early adolescence. Then we've got social development and attachment. So this is the relationship between an infant and their primary caretaker or their mother, traditionally. So there are 3 different attachment styles. So we'll get to those in a minute. Harry Harlow did a famous experiment with these little baby infant monkeys that are adorable, and he found that these monkeys preferred to be comforted more than fed. So they needed nurturing. So he believed that love was provided by comfort, not food. John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, I believe, proposed an attachment theory, recognizing that there were primarily 3 means by which, or ways by which, infants and young children could become attached to their primary caretaker or mother. There can be secure attachment when the infant is confident that their mother will take care of them, and then the 2 forms of insecure attachment, which you can look at. It looks like here there's a 4th later identified. I'm not familiar with that one. But you can read about the strange situation experiment and how each of those attachment styles manifest differently. You can also type in Mary Ainsworth strange situation into YouTube and watch an actual experiment and have the psychologist walk you through them. There's a bunch of them on YouTube. Here's a list of those 4. I don't know disorganized, so let me look at that. Show odd behavior around caregiver, behave oddly when mother left, froze or ran around erratically, sounds like anxious, tried to run away when mother returned, common when child has been abused. Okay, so I think that was sort of ambivalent before, but I don't see ambivalent on here anymore. Secure, insecure avoidant, insecure resistant, and insecure disorganized. So you might need to look up a newer experiment than the strange situation because disorganized didn't exist originally. Now we have the development of your sense of self. This idea that you are your own person, so at first you won't even differentiate yourselves from others, but then over time you recognize that you are distinct from other people. You can build relationships, understand that what you do can affect others and what they do can affect you. These are all different levels of self-concept recognition and understanding. Now we're getting on to parenting styles. So there's 4 well-documented, really 3 well-documented parenting styles, and then the uninvolved, I think, is a phenomenon of the last 20 or 30 years. Authoritative is heralded as the best at developing emotional intelligence in your children and supporting good mental health qualities. Authoritarian and permissive have bad emotional intelligence consequences and mental health problems. I'll let you read about what those are. Temperament is something that's pretty constant throughout the lifespan, and the parenting style might be influenced by the temperament of the child. So there's easy temperament, where children are happy, willing to change, regulate emotions well, and then difficult temperament, have negative emotions and difficulty adapting to change. Notice they're saying that parenting styles depend on the temperament, but earlier, maybe 40 years ago, it was understood that parenting styles influence the temperament of the child. So they're recognizing, I guess, a reciprocal relationship. Perhaps the temperament predicts parenting style and not the other way around. I don't know about that. I'd have to look at the research. All right. Are we just at adolescence now? I want to see how far we have to go. Wow. There's still like 100 slides. So now we're getting into adolescence. The same kind of breakdown. The body changes. You can read about that. The brain changes. The brain changes a lot early in life and then up until about, in adolescence, the frontal lobe is growing a lot. In childhood, it's like this part of the brain, this part of the brain. So the midbrain, the temporal lobe, occipital lobe, the motor cortex. And then in adolescence and early adulthood, that's when we get the frontal lobe really starts to develop. That's where we can have motivation, recognize our identity, make plans, looks like controlling risk-taking behaviors, and so on. The mind continues to develop, and this is when empathy begins. There's some arguments that, so theory of mind, being able to recognize other people's experiences and try to empathize with them, try to feel what they're feeling. And there's arguments that people with autism don't have that, but I and others disagree with that approach. So empathy tends to grow in adolescence. It used to grow in like middle school, 8 years old. That's slowed down quite a bit in the last 20 years or so. Some argue social media and phone use is responsible for that. Psychosocial development, so in adolescence, what sort of relationships are changing? This is the sense of their own identity and personality, trying to lock that in. Who are they? The relationship with parents changes. Then we have adulthood, this new form of adulthood called emerging adulthood. In the 70s and 80s and 90s, it wasn't unusual for people in their early 20s to just be employed full-time with families, but now the average age of starting a family is like late 20s, and even later, so like I think 26, 27 for women, 27, 28, 29 for men, so it just keeps going further and further, so that new block of time between 18 and 26 is now emerging adulthood. And there's some reasons listed there why there is this new stage. The body doesn't grow as much in adulthood. In fact, decline begins. So like muscles, you lose muscle mass the older you get. If you don't stay on top of it, it's harder to maintain muscle mass. Skin loses elasticity. Bone strength, I think, begins to go down. Hair changes color. So I've got some like gray in my beard now. And then sense, your senses decline. So like your vision, olfaction, audition, and so on. There are some intelligence declines, which is why it's so important that you do your education in your 20s, because your cognitive acuity begins to go down even in your 30s, but it picks up from there. Psychosocial development, of course, you are employed now, so you're building, or if you go into employment, you're building those sorts of relationships and competence in your job, but then also as you get through the retirement period, finding a new form of social escape, a social connection with others. In old age, it's sometimes harder to build those relationships or feel like appreciated and accepted. And so there's the whole field of like gerontology and late adult development is very interesting. And then late in life, I mentioned it goes from birth to death. If someone dies, there are these stages of grief that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross identified, although this was just based on, I think, a survey. So most people tend to go through these 5 stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. But it's entirely possible for you to skip one or only focus on one, or focus on a few of them or have them in a different order. But typically, when you lose something, if it's someone you love, you care about, it's your job, maybe it's you miss a piece of birthday cake at a party, and so you kind of go through these stages, but typically it's a pretty extreme loss that elicits that. And then different cultures have different ways of celebrating or appreciating, remembering the dead. And so here's looks like a cremation in a Hindu ceremony, and then here's a burial for a naval ceremony of the U.S. Navy, and then here we've got like a familiar grave site in what are those called? Cemeteries. As you can tell, I'm starting to get tired. And that gets us to the end of it. So that is human development.